Okay. And I'm going to begin now.
See, I'm already thinking, why is it useful for have us both clapping at the same time? Wouldn't you just want me going 3, 2, 1, and now you do it?
3, 2, 1. Mr. Mangold.
Yes.
Oscar-nominated director. We got him here. Right.
All right.
Here we go. Intro now. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. I'm talking to some of the people behind this year's Oscar-nominated films, and today I'm here with James Mangold. James has had a truly wide-ranging career, directing westerns like 3:10 to Yuma.
There's gonna be 30, 40 more guns out there now.
Superhero films such as The Wolverine and Logan.
And I am not taking it.
Classical sports dramas like Ford vs. Ferrari.
Just shut your mouth and let me do my thing.
And action adventures like Indiana Jones and The Dial of Destiny. In 2005, he released Walk the Line, a film about the life of musician Johnny Cash.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
And this year, he tackles another American master.
Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son?
His film A Complete Unknown, which looks at Bob Dylan and his formative years in early 1960s New York City, received nominations for, among many others, Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay.
It's a heart, oh, it's a heart.
James Mangold, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gilbert. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. So, A Complete Unknown, it's adapted from Elijah Wald's 2015 book, Dylan Goes Electric. And that book, of course, is about Bob Dylan, but it's also about a lot of other stuff. It's about the folk movement, it's about Pete Seeger, and it's about these big culture shifts that are taking place in the 1960s. I wonder if you could talk to me about how you take that nonfiction book and then you turn it into a James Mangold film about Bob Dylan.
I first took a hold of this project when I got wind of Elijah's book, and Jay Cox had been adapting it, and I got to read Jay's script. And one of the things that was clear to me, Elijah's book, it's called Going Electric, and it is a very factual and meticulous recounting of the events and personalities that led up to Bob's electric performance at Newport in 65, and was, of course, incredibly instrumental in what we were laying out. One of the things Wald does in his book that I think was so important is by defining the period of time that Wald was looking at, by really focusing on this period, 5 years, let's say, between 60 and 65, it gives you a kind of focus for what could be a screenplay and a film that is not as easy to find when someone's writing a kind of full biography that starts at birth and ends at death or a Nobel Prize. The sprawling nature of so many biographical texts produces a singular challenge for movies which just don't have the running time to adequately dramatize that much life. You need to boil it down to something recognizable as a story.
Right.
So biographical texts, by and large, are really challenging. They had had a kind of mandate that it be about the music and just the music and not the other stuff, right? And when I came on, I started writing about the other stuff. And if you didn't come to understand his connections to Joan, to Sylvie, Suze Rotolo, to Pete Seeger, if you didn't understand these personal relationships better, none of it would ever make sense except on this kind of, MTV music docu level. I didn't want to make just a behind the music in which it's like the whole issue of the movie becomes Bob going electric, and how culturally, quote unquote, important that was. What I found fascinating was that this seemed to be the story of a family, and Newport 65 was a kind of like a Thanksgiving run amok in which the prodigal son ends up getting in a fight with dad and driving away, and that there was a personal element to what was happening that added context and awareness that this was less about people deciding to make history on that night and more about a brewing tension that existed within this folk music tribe for 5 years and was coming to a head.
Tell me about the first time you met Bob Dylan.
Well, when I first met Bob Dylan, was when I wrote and handed in a draft that went into areas I was told I shouldn't go. And his management team.
Like personal stuff? Is that what it was?
Personal, yes. Just getting into his romantic life and personal stuff. It wasn't like a freak out, but it was just like, I don't know about this. And that's when COVID hit in early 2020, and the movie kind of ground to a halt as something that was about to happen anyway. And about a couple months later, I think in February or March, I got a call from Jeff Rosen, and he said, so Bob's tour was canceled for COVID. And so he asked to read your script. And I went, okay. And Jeff said, and he did. And he likes it. And he'd like to sit down with you. And what then happened during COVID was a series, I think, of 3 or 4 times we sat down together for at least a half day, a session, and covered anything and everything I could possibly ask him or he could offer me about this period. And his interest in what I was doing was really interesting. And his whole attitude was really warm and collaborative. And I have to say, although I was nervous going to the first meeting, I was kind of at ease within seconds and felt that he, once again, was a character who was surprising me.
That must have been an incredible contrast. He's someone who has often come off as a little bit keeping people at a distance, to hear that he was, after this initial meeting, just sort of relatively open with you about this period in his life is surprising.
It also was illuminating because we have to remember that so much of what we know about people, particularly famous people, is what we see of them in interviews or in documentaries or on stage. All of these situations are pretenses. All of these situations are dangerous for the person participating in the interview, in the sense that what I say can and will be used against me. I found it really interesting sitting with him where that wasn't on the line, and we were having a kind of free-ranging conversation where I wasn't scribbling everything down, and where I felt that I had a very unself-aware, very honest person in front of me who had just admitted, frankly, that in some ways he still doesn't understand, much the way you or I or anyone might not remember exactly why things went down like they did when he was 22 years old, and looking back 60 years. Because so much of what goes on in our youth, in our young lives, is emotional and driven by issues of identity and fear and self-consciousness. Many people describe Bob, as you said, as aloof or enigmatic or arrogant. Well, what causes a person to be seen that way? And what is it that's going on inside them? Are they uncomfortable socially, or are there other things?
Many people of my age and older, I've thought about Bob Dylan maybe more than I should have, but it really came across how just really young he was when he came to New York, partially because Timothée Chalamet is a young-looking man, and partially because you really understand, like, he just left home, and here he is all of a sudden. Yeah.
He wrote 25 or 30 of the most important songs of the century before he hit his 24th birthday. And And Timmy is about 5 or 6 years too old to be playing him. So you're kind of you're really forced to confront how very young Bob Dylan was landing in New York and inventing this persona. It's so interesting, though, in this role of making biographical films based on life, because I had the exact same reaction when I made Walk the Line with Joaquin Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
When people saw that I'd cast him as Johnny Cash, everyone was like, he's so young. We have all these biases we walk into these movies with. We have the Bob Dylan we know, and that Bob Dylan is a lot older than this kid in this movie.
Uh-huh.
And that's part of the joy of making a movie like this, is you're right from the beginning going, I think you're walking in expecting X, but we're going to show you why. Because you know X well enough already. We're actually exploring something you don't know so much about that's a stone less turned.
Walk the Line, your film about Johnny Cash, that was adapted from 2 of his autobiographies. I am also curious about what you've learned about adapting a work about a real person. What are the things that you need to focus on? How do you tell the story of a life in a way that is sort of legible to people? The way you do it in these 2 movies are very different in terms of scope. But I have to think there's some things that sort of join them together.
Well, one of the things you do is you have to define your own goals. Movies are bad at dispensing nuggets of factual information in the sense that they don't come with dates. Heavy, my first movie, was essentially based on reality that I grew up around. So as writers, we're always drawing upon something. And what you're after in your movie is to capture the essence of that thing, the thing that movies can do that a book can't do in the same way, even a documentary can't do in the same way, which is to drop you into this world unfiltered, where the characters are not performing, which is you want to make people feel like they were there, watching something happen in a way that may surprise them, because it's not how it was described necessarily historically, looking backward with this sense of importance. What's it like to watch someone making up a song that's going to be huge when none of them know it's going to be huge? All of that stuff becomes really interesting stuff to investigate that you can't necessarily do in the same way these other mediums do it.
How would you describe the challenge of visualizing creation? In rewatching Walk the Line, you have early scenes of him in an airplane hangar in Germany working on some of his songs. You have scenes in A Complete Unknown of Bob Dylan sitting down, sort of picking out different parts of songs that we know will become very famous. How do you make something like that interesting?
You try to forget about the very thing you're bringing up and try and go, what did this song come from? Why now? What is it saying about him? Timothy had an acting teacher. I love this quote. He told me, that musical theater is just acting on pitch. I had a very similar philosophy. The music is dialogue. The music is Bob's most personal expression. They are monologues of personal outlook for the lead character, and he is making them up as we watch him. And his personal life, his struggles, his ambition, his fears, what he's learning about the world, all of it is funneling into this sponge of his mind and coming out as fragmentary pieces of beautiful writing. And what I think we had to do in putting that on the screen was to make it feel unimportant and let the words and the power of the music and Timmy's performance make it important in the moment. But I tried not to kind of hit each song with a highlighter pen visually so that it kind of felt like important moment in rock history here.
Yeah.
Because I think that the songs do that work on their own.
One of the most entertaining parts of the movie, for me at least, honestly, was the relationship between Pete Seeger, who's played by Edward Norton, and Timmy's Bob Dylan.
This dusty old dust, it's taken me home, and I've gotta be drifting along.
Pete Seeger, a major figure in the American folk movement. He sees in Dylan someone who he can sort of shape into an avatar, the one that's going to go out and help popularize this movement. You, in your early life, you had some amazing mentors when you were at CalArts. You had Alexandra McKendrick, who did Sweet Smell of Success. You worked with Milos Forman, who directed Amadeus. How did having accomplished mentors like that sort of inform the way that you thought about that particular relationship in the movie?
That's such an interesting question. It's an incredible gift early in your life to be recognized, to feel that someone who knows what it is you aspire to do thinks you might be able to do it. I don't know if Pete saw Bob as the salvation or elevating factor that would solve all of folks' problems at the moment he met him.
Mm-hmm.
But I think by 1963 and 4, when he's singing Times They Are Changing, and he now sees him and recognizes that this isn't just a phenomenally talented young man, but it's a young man who is talented and also has his finger somehow on the pulse in a way that is impossible to describe. But by the end of the picture, when he's trying to keep Bob in their pocket or in the tribe, if you will, he is literally trying to preserve the expansion that folk music has had, and finds himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to kind of keep an empire from getting broken up.
Right.
And I found that really interesting. I mean, in relation to my own life, again, I think for all young artists, when an artist of tremendous ability or note gives you even just a moment or two of their time, it just allows you to believe that you're not wrong to be trying.
Someone that I imagine you got to know in your last movie, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, maybe you got to know him before, was Steven Spielberg. There's a thing that some people call a Spielberg face. This is the face of someone who is looking on awe in something. A dinosaur, a spaceship, President Lincoln.
You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth.
Right? So you have your fair share of reaction shots in this movie.
Some writers and critics who prophesize with your pen.
People looking at Bob Dylan in awe because they're seeing something they've never seen before.
Again, and don't speak too soon, for the wheels still in spin, and there's no telling.
They're sort of struck dumb by this wunderkind.
For the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are changing.
I'm wondering how you thought about the way in which you were modulating the experience of Dylan being Dylan and then the people around him looking upon him.
Well, I didn't always think that the shots of listeners would be only about awe. I thought it's interesting. You read what you want to read on their faces because they're not saying anything. But I find some of them are anguished, jealous, envious, trying to figure out how in he does this. Where did this come from? But the relationship, I mean, for me, movies are all about reaction shots. Movies are all about silent storytelling. What can a movie do better than anyone else? It can look behind the eyes. It can see things we don't say. That's harder to show on a stage from row 5 beyond. You can hear what they're saying. You can see their body, their physical behavior, but a motion picture camera is a kind of X-ray, a CAT scan, a kind of penetrating laser that looks into the eyes from only inches away of your characters and can see human thought. And I like to think that some of the shots of people listening to Bob are more complicated than just simply awe. But it's up to you how you want to process it. And some of them are awe. But but for me, some of the most interesting ones are the ones that deviate from such a simple categorization. That's part of my fascination with all those kinds of shots you're describing.
Well, when I watch it for a third time, even though I want to hear the music, I will try and put off the sound during a couple scenes and see how it goes.
You don't even have to be that orthodox about it. You could just go, what am I seeing? How he's looking at Joan, how Joan's looking at him, how Sylvie is backstage. What is Alan Lomax feeling? Where is Pete right now? Where's Toshi? I think of my job as spinning plates, and I have to visit all these characters and give them a little spin every so often, or they start to vanish. And I really loved the world of this folk music scene. It's not only about Bob. And I think that it was especially important, and I think this references, Gilbert, a question you asked a while ago, for this particular movie with this particular strategy on telling the story, because I was not, unlike Walk the Line, I was not doing a kind of Freudian analysis of how a traumatic childhood event and loss impacted a person and rendered them unable to cope and vulnerable to addiction, etc. That wasn't this story. If anything, the secret of the movie that I think many people miss because they're looking for a more conventional Freudian one is that Bob Dylan's burden is his intellect, his ability, or maybe his oddness, but that part of what he has to live life with is that he processes the world, questions, crowds, music, words themselves differently than we do.
I think it is interesting and somewhat surprising to some people to walk into a movie that they think is going to be a regular biographical film and walk out feeling as if they still don't understand this man, that they are used to having the psychology of famous people explained to them through movies. And that's certainly not what happens in this, maybe because it's not possible with this particular person.
Or is it even desirable? I mean, so many people also can wax on about the tropes of biographical films. Well, one of the biggest tropes is just reducing the person to a kind of simplistic trauma or event in their life that changed everything, when, of course, we're all so much more complicated than that, and our psychologies are such a stew of so many things. But like I'm saying, what if the secret, what if the thing we don't understand, we just don't want to understand, which is that he's actually different?
You're blowing my mind, James.
That it's not from trauma. It's not from abuse. It's not because of a chemical imbalance. It might just be because he's built different or socially awkward or invested in the interior life. He's an introvert whose career puts him on stage. There's a scene when he's walking with Elle Fanning early in the film, and they're on kind of their first date.
I'm at my mom's in the afternoon.
And she moves to kiss him goodnight on the cheek.
Call me there?
And Timmy did this thing where he kind of pulls away as she kisses him, almost like it scared him a little. And it wasn't something we discussed before he did it, but it made so much sense when he did. And what does that mean? Do I need to explain that? Does intimacy create anxiety for this character? Maybe. The actor playing him intuitively felt it might. And is that an answer? If you ask me.
I'm asking you.
Most of our desire for more answers from Bob Dylan in specific are a very strange request given he's an artist who has been so prolific. Meaning there's many artists, let's just use Frank Sinatra as an example, who, did he write any songs? I don't think so. Let's say he wrote a couple just to cover ourselves.
Sure.
A 60-year career, but no one called him an enigma. Bob's been touring 60 years. He's written 55 albums of music, much of it deeply personal or political. And yet we complain that he won't tell us what he thinks. It is kind of odd. And my suspicion is that because his writing is so damned interesting and creates new questions as many as it answers, and then he refuses to explain those questions, we get a little bit perturbed that he won't give us a kind of pat answer on what that song meant. And I don't think that's fair to him. I don't think we hold other artists to that standard. I just think his art is so evocative and perplexing that we want more answers and he won't give them. And maybe that's our problem.
I'm very uncomfortable with uncertainty, so maybe I'm part of the problem.
Yeah, but art is extremely successful in uncertainty and extremely rote and a child's book when it gives you certainty. Landing a dramatic plane exactly where you knew it was going to land may be reassuring, but it's also kind of uninspiring and uninforming.
Well, I don't think that anyone thinks that is what you did in A Complete Unknown.
I hope not.
I have to end by asking, 55 albums, multiple documentaries, several movies, what is your favorite Dylan thing? Your favorite thing that he's done or been in?
I mean, I've lived in his world with his music, and not just the albums, but the outtakes and the box sets and the unreleaseds and the Blind Willie McTell is a great song, a kind of epic song that if I could have put a song of his at the end of the movie, meaning of Bob singing it, if I was going to do that, I would have put that song. I find it in kind of an epic Dylan song.
I have to have one follow-up question. Was there any point when you said, I actually want to hear Dylan's actual voice in this movie? No. It just would have thrown off the whole thing. A song is playing over the credits, and it's Bob Dylan.
It could have been, but I think ultimately we felt the illusion of Bobness that we created with Timmy. Just, I didn't want to break it. The achievement that Chalamet got to was so complete that I really, in a way, didn't want to destroy the magic trick.
James Mangold, thank you so much for joining the Book Review podcast. It really has been a pleasure to talk to you about A Complete Unknown.
Might as well. Have me back. It was a joy. Thank you.